4. Their interest grew, however, when, the day before Swann was to dine with us, and when he had made them a special present of a case of Asti, my great aunt, who had in her hand a copy of the Figaro, in which to the name of a picture then on view in a Corot exhibition were added the words, "From the collection of Monsieur Charles Swann," asked, "Did you see that Swann is mentioned in the Figaro?" "But I have always told you," said my grandmother, "that he had plenty of taste." "You would, of course," retorted my great aunt, "say anything just to seem different from us." For, knowing that my grandmother never agreed with her, and not being quite confident that it was her own opinion which the rest of us invariably endorsed, she wished to extort from us a wholesale condemnation of my grandmother's views, against which she hoped to force us into solidarity with her own. But we sat silent. My grandmother's sisters having expressed a desire to mention to Swann this reference to him in the Figaro, my great aunt dissuaded them. Whenever she saw in others an advantage, however trivial, which she herself lacked, she would persuade herself that it was no advantage at all, but a drawback, and would pity so as not to have to envy them. I don't think that would please him at all. I know very well I should hate to see my name printed like that, as large as life, in the paper, and I shouldn't feel at all flattered if any one spoke to me about it. She did not, however, put any very great pressure upon my grandmother's sisters, for they, in their horror of vulgarity, had brought to such a fine art the concealment of a personal allusion and a wealth of ingenious circumlocution, that it would often pass unnoticed even by the person to whom it was addressed. As for my mother, her only thought was of managing to induce my father to consent to speak to Swann, not of his wife, but of his daughter, whom he worshipped, and for whose sake it was understood that he had ultimately made his unfortunate marriage. "You need only say a word. Just ask him how she is. It must be so very hard for him." My father, however, was annoyed. "No, no, you have the most absurd ideas. It would be utterly ridiculous." But the only one of us in whom the prospect of Swann's arrival gave rise to an unhappy foreboding was myself, and that was because on the evenings when there were visitors, or just Monsieur Swann in the house, Mamma did not come up to my room. I did not at that time have dinner with the family. I came out to the garden after dinner, and at 9 I said good night and went to bed. But on these evenings I used to dine earlier than the others, and to come in afterwards and sit at table until 8 o'clock, when it was understood that I must go upstairs. That frail and precious kiss which Mamma used always to leave upon my lips when I was in bed, and just going to sleep I had to take with me from the dining room to my own, and to keep inviolate all the time that it took me to undress, without letting its sweet charm be broken, without letting its volatile essence diffuse itself and evaporate. And just on those very evenings when I must needs take most pains to receive it with due formality, I had to snatch it, to seize it instantly and in public, without even having the time, or being properly free, to apply what I was doing, the punctiliousness which madmen use who compel themselves to exclude all other thoughts from their minds while they are shutting a door, so that when the sickness of uncertainty sweeps over them again, they can triumphantly face and overcome it with the recollection of the precise moment in which the door was shut. We were all in the garden when the double peal of the gate bell sounded shyly. Every one knew that it must be Swann, and yet they looked at one another inquiringly, and sent my grandmother scouting. "See that you thank him intelligibly for the wine," my grandfather warned his two sisters in law. "You know how good it is, and it is a huge case." "Now don't start whispering," said my great aunt. "How would you like to come into a house and find every one muttering to themselves?" "Ah, there's Monsieur Swann!" cried my father. "Let's ask him if he thinks it will be fine to morrow." My mother fancied that a word from her would wipe out all the unpleasantness which my family had contrived to make Swann feel since his marriage. She found an opportunity to draw him aside for a moment, but I followed her. I could not bring myself to let her go out of reach of me, while I felt that in a few minutes I should have to leave her in the dining room and go up to my bed without the consoling thought, as on ordinary evenings, that she would come up later to kiss me. "Now, Monsieur Swann," she said, "do tell me about your daughter. I am sure she shows a taste already for nice things, like her papa." "Come along and sit down here with us all on the veranda," said my grandfather, coming up to him. My mother had to abandon the quest, but managed to extract from the restriction itself a further refinement of thought, as great poets do when the tyranny of rhyme forces them into the discovery of their finest lines. "We can talk about her again when we are by ourselves," she said, or rather whispered to Swann. "It is only a mother who can understand. I am sure that hers would agree with me." And so we all sat down round the iron table. I should have liked not to think of the hours of anguish which I should have to spend, that evening, alone in my room, without the possibility of going to sleep. I tried to convince myself that they were of no importance, really, since I should have forgotten them next morning, and to fix my mind on thoughts of the future which would carry me, as on a bridge, across the terrifying abyss that yawned at my feet. But my mind, strained by this foreboding, distended like the look which I shot at my mother, would not allow any other impression to enter. Thoughts did indeed enter it, but only on the condition that they left behind them every element of beauty, or even of quaintness, by which I might have been distracted or beguiled. As a surgical patient, by means of a local anesthetic, can look on with a clear consciousness while an operation is being performed upon him and yet feel nothing, I could repeat to myself some favorite lines, or watch my grandfather attempting to talk to Swann about the Duc d'Audriffet Pasquier without being able to kindle any emotion from one or amusement from the other. Hardly had my grandfather begun to question Swann about that orator, when one of my grandmother's sisters, in whose ears the question echoed like a solemn but untimely silence, which her natural politeness bade her interrupt, addressed the other with, "Just fancy, Flora, I met a young Swedish governess to day who told me some most interesting things about the cooperative movement in Scandinavia. We really must have her to dine here one evening." "To be sure," said her sister Flora, "but I haven't wasted my time either. I met such a clever old gentleman at Monsieur Vinteuil's who knows Maubant quite well, and Maubant has told him every little thing about how he gets up his parts. It is the most interesting thing I ever heard. He is a neighbor of Monsieur Vinteuil's, and I never knew, and he is so nice besides." "Monsieur Vinteuil's is not the only one who has nice neighbors," cried my Aunt Céline, in a voice which seemed loud because she was so timid, and seemed forced because she had been planning the little speech for so long, darting, as she spoke, what she called a "significant glance" at Swann. And my Aunt Flora, who realized that this veiled utterance was Céline's way of thanking Swann intelligibly for the Asti, looked at him with a blend of congratulation and irony, either just because she wished to underline her sister's little epigram, or because she envied Swann his having inspired it, or merely because she imagined that he was embarrassed, and could not help having a little fun at his expense. "I think it would be worth while," Flora went on, "to have this old gentleman to dinner. When you get him upon Maubant or Madame Materna, he will talk for hours on end." "That must be delightful," sighed my grandfather, in whose mind nature had unfortunately forgotten to include any capacity whatsoever for becoming passionately interested in the cooperative movement among the ladies of Sweden, or in the methods employed by Maubant to get up his parts, just as it had forgotten to endow my grandmother's two sisters with a grain of that precious salt which one has oneself to add to taste in order to extract any savor from a narrative of the private life of Mole or of the Comte de Paris. "I say," exclaimed Swann to my grandfather, "what I was going to tell you has more to do than you might think with what you were asking me just now, for in some respects there has been very little change. I came across a passage in Saint Simon this morning which would have amused you. It is in the volume which covers his mission to Spain, not one of the best, little more in fact than a journal, but at least it is a journal wonderfully well written, which fairly distinguishes it from the devastating journalism that we feel bound to read in these days, morning, noon, and night." "I do not agree with you. There are some days when I find reading the papers very pleasant indeed," my Aunt Flora broke in, to show Swann that she had read the note about his Corot in the Figaro. "Yes," Aunt Celine went one better, "when they write about things or people in whom we are interested." "I don't deny it," answered Swann in some bewilderment. "The fault I find with our journalism is that it forces us to take an interest in some fresh triviality or other every day, whereas only 3 or 4 books in a lifetime give us anything that is of real importance. Suppose that every morning when we tore the wrapper off our paper with fevered hands, a transmutation were to take place, and we were to find inside it, oh, I don't know, shall we say Pascal's Pensées?" She articulated the title with an ironic emphasis, so as not to appear pedantic. "And then, in the gilt and tooled volumes which we open once in 10 years," he went on, showing that contempt for the things of this world which even men of the world like to affect, "we should read that the Queen of the Hellenes had arrived at Cannes, or that the Princesse de Lion had given a fancy dress ball. In that way we should arrive at the right proportion between information and publicity." But at once regretting that he had allowed himself to speak, even in jest, of serious matters, he added ironically, "We are having a most entertaining conversation. I cannot think why we climb to these lofty summits." And then, turning to my grandfather, "Well, Saint Simon tells how Maulevrier had had the audacity to offer his hand to his sons. You remember how he says of Maulevrier, 'Never did I find in that coarse bottle anything but ill humor, boorishness, and folly.'" "Coarse or not, I know bottles in which there is something very different," said Flora briskly, feeling bound to thank Swann as well as her sister, since the present of Asti had been addressed to them both. Céline began to laugh. Swann was puzzled, but went on. "I cannot say whether it was his ignorance or a trap," writes Saint Simon. "He wished to give his hand to my children. I noticed it in time to prevent him." My grandfather was always in ecstasy over ignorance or a trap, but Miss Céline (the name of Saint Simon, a man of letters, having arrested the complete paralysis of her sense of hearing) had grown angry. "What? You admire that, do you? Well, it is clever enough. But what is the point of it? Does he mean that one man isn't as good as another? What difference can it make whether he is a duke or a groom, so long as he is intelligent and good? He had a fine way of bringing up his children, your Saint Simon, if he didn't teach them to shake hands with all honest men. Really and truly, it's abominable. And you dare to quote it!" And my grandfather, utterly depressed, realizing how futile it would be for him, against this opposition, to attempt to get Swann to tell him the stories which would have amused him, murmured to my mother, "Just tell me again that line of yours, which always comforts me so much on these occasions. Oh, yes. 'What virtues, Lord, thou makest us abhor.' Good! That is, very good." I never took my eyes off my mother. I knew that when they were at table I should not be permitted to stay there for the whole of dinner time, and that Mamma, for fear of annoying my father, would not allow me to give her in public the series of kisses that she would have had in my room. And so I promised myself that in the dining room, as they began to eat and drink, and as I felt the hour approach, I would put beforehand into this kiss, which was bound to be so brief and stealthy in execution, everything that my own efforts could put into it, would look out very carefully first the exact spot on her cheek where I would imprint it, and would so prepare my thoughts that I might be able, thanks to these mental preliminaries, to consecrate the whole of the minute Mamma would allow me to the sensation of her cheek against my lips, as a painter who can have his subject for short sittings only, prepares his palette, and from what he remembers and from rough notes, does in advance everything which he possibly can do in the sitter's absence. But to-night, before the dinner bell had sounded, my grandfather said with unconscious cruelty, "The little man looks tired. He'd better go up to bed. Besides, we are dining late to-night." And my father, who was less scrupulous than my grandmother or mother in observing the letter of a treaty, went on, "Yes, run along. To bed with you." I would have kissed Mamma then and there, but at that moment the dinner bell rang. "No, no, leave your mother alone. You've said good night quite enough. These exhibitions are absurd. Go on upstairs." And so I must set forth without viaticum, must climb each step of the staircase against my heart, as the saying is, climbing in opposition to my heart's desire, which was to return to my mother, since she had not, by her kiss, given my heart leave to accompany me forth. That hateful staircase, up which I always passed with such dismay, gave out a smell of varnish which had to some extent absorbed, made definite, and fixed the special quality of sorrow that I felt each evening, and made it perhaps even more cruel to my sensibility, because, when it assumed this olfactory guise, my intellect was powerless to resist it. When we have gone to sleep with the maddening toothache, and are conscious of it only as a little girl whom we attempt time after time to pull out of the water, or as a line of Molière which we repeat incessantly to ourselves, it is a great relief to wake up, so that our intelligence can disentangle the idea of toothache from any artificial semblance of heroism or rhythmic cadence. It was the precise converse of this relief, which I felt when my anguish at having to go up to my room invaded my consciousness in a manner infinitely more rapid, instantaneous almost, a manner at once insidious and brutal, as I breathed in a far more poisonous thing than any moral penetration the peculiar smell of the varnish upon that staircase. Part 2 Section 4